I am going to start. Aloha mai kako, a warm welcome to this event that is hosted by the Department of Ethnic Studies. Mahalo for joining us this afternoon. For our guests in Los Angeles from the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, it's already evening. I am Monisha Dasgupta, and I teach in the Departments of Ethnic Studies, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. I want to thank the Department of Ethnic Studies and the UHM Office of Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, Access, and Success for their support. It's an awesome office. Many thanks to the co-organizer of this event, my colleague in Ethnic Studies, Richard Rath, our awesome graduate assistant, Caillou Lewis, and ES Major and Ethnic Studies Student Association member, Kenzie Ozawa. As many of you may know, that the Department of Ethnic Studies was born out of the movement protesting the evictions of farming and working class people in Kalama Valley, in Halava, Ota Camp, and Chinatown in the 1970s. Our department's commitment to the this kind of community-based work continues as we confront an escalation in evictions and gentrification, houselessness, and an intensification in the policing of those who are unhoused. Our university is located in beautiful Manoa Valley in Honolulu. We come to you from the unceded Aina, to which Kanaka Maoli belong and which they steward. To ground ourselves in place, please share in chat the Aina from which you're calling, because we're calling from different places. This emplacement is actually relevant for our workshop today because the coalition will be talking about the relationship between land and people rooted in it to policing and banishment. The first hour of this event will be recorded. If you can and are comfortable doing so, please turn on your video so that we can see each other. In case, and if you're not speaking, please do mute yourself. If there are any disruptions to our Zoom session, we hope to get things back on track very quickly. In case we have to restart the event, please monitor your emails. Mahalo to our guests from Stop LAPD Spying Coalition for being with us today. The coalition was founded in 2011 and is rooted in Skid Row in Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles. The coalition is excited today to share how it has built power with communities that are most harmed by policing. The title of our event comes from a new coalition report called Automating Banishment. The surveillance, it's a new report by the coalition, and it's called Automating Banishment, the Surveillance and Policing of Looted Land. We have gathered all the links, including to this report by the coalition, as well as details about the event, bios of our guests, and a list of resources all in one place. And Kenzie will be dropping that link in chat. We are joined today by 4 Stop LAPD Spying Coalition members, and I'm going to introduce them. It's my great honor to do so. Ni Anaya is a Mistec artist and community organizer for the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. Hamid Khan founded the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition in 2011 and is an organizer with the coalition. Between 1990 and 2010, he served as the executive director of Artesia-based South Asian Network, and which he also founded. And Rich and I have known Hamid for over a decade, and we feel fortunate to have seen Hamid in action while he's organizing. Matthias Kidane is a community organizer for the Stop LAPD Coalition and a member of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. And Shakir Rahman is a lawyer and community organizer with the Stop LAPD Coalition. He was previously an impact litigation attorney at the Bronx Defenders. There he worked on systemic lawsuits against the police and courts. In the spirit of collective learning, the coalition members requested that we weave in shares from community members. We have invited Laulani Teal, Noelani Ahia, Tatiana Kalaniapua Young, Tina Grandinetti, and Richard Rath to say a few words about their work. There are many, of course, in our audience who know and experience these issues intimately, and there will be lots of opportunities to hear from you as well. The second hour of this event will be dedicated to exchanging strategies to build power together in breakout rooms, and we will give you the information then. With that, I invite our friends and comrades from the coalition to get us started.
Go ahead, Shakir. I thought are we gonna just say hello, or because
just say hello and
okay, that's what I thought, because I thought we had a different plan. So okay, yeah, that's what I thought, Shakir, you were gonna say hello. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, thanks Hamid, thanks Monisha for the introduction. I hadn't realized that the introduction we read out loud, I would not have emphasized what I emphasized in it if I knew that. But yeah, we're really excited to talk to everyone. Yeah, this is, we're going to be talking, as Monisha explained, mostly about, we'll just kind of grounded in this new report that we put out called Automating Banishment, that is really about policing's relationship to real estate development, as well as policing's relationship to settler colonialism and conquest. And, we're obviously studying that in the context of Los Angeles and what what the coalition has been organizing against for the last decade, and what before us, different communities, different social movements, different groups, and just, stretching back to our ancestors over time have been fighting against. So I think, should we start by,
I'll take it over. Thanks so much, Shakir. It is my great pleasure to introduce Laulani Teal and Noelani Ahia. They will start us off with some of their own encounters and experiences with the criminalization of houseless and policing, as well as gentrification. Laulani Teal is an activist, musician, healer, and peacemaker. She works directly with unhoused people on the islands. As a musician and composer, she brings creativity and passion to social change. As a traditional Hawaiian healer, she looks at underlying social causes and focuses equally on individual well-being. As a peacemaker, she brings the principles of sovereignty and aloha to all her work. Noelani Ahia is a healer activist who co-founded the Moana Medic Healers Hui. They provided much needed care to Kiai during the 2019 occupation of Mauna Kea. On Maui, she works as a Chinese medicine practitioner, a protector of ancestral burials, and an advocate for Maui houseless community. Noelani has been supporting the residents of a houseless encampment at Puhonua o Kanaha, forcibly evicted by Maui County late last year. So with that, I invite Laulani to start us off, and then Noelani.
Aloha. Well, it's hard to cover our situation in such a short time, but I will just touch on some really important things that are happening, in the past and the future and present. I was asked to talk about Kanawai Mamalahoi, and that's a hard thing to cover in a few minutes. So I am going to say that in case I run out of time, I also want to mention something looking forward that I think is very, very important to look at, is the intersection of the criminalization of culture and mental health as it applies to houselessness, because that's going to be a really, really big thing that is coming up on the horizon. And I don't know whether I'm going to have time to talk about it, but I'll leave it at that for now. It's just that I will say that they built a really big prison in Kaneohe, and it's not just to, have medical appointments at. It is to criminalize those who are on the fringe. And traditionally, the culture that we live as Kanaka has been on that fringe, along with those who are neurodiverse and along with those who are unhoused for other reasons too. I was asked to cover Kanawai Mamalahoi. What I can say about it in a very short time is just that it is the first law of our kingdom. We in Hawaii are an illegally occupied country. We are not a state. That is a fiction. And I believe that it is well established amongst those who study anything here, politics, history, anything. We all know that, but it's not well known in the United States or even amongst the mainstream in the state of Hawaii, quote unquote. So it's very important to understand that continuation of Kanawai Mamalahoi and upholding that is very key to restoring our sovereignty and independence. Kanawai Mamalahoi came out of an incident of ku'e or resistance where a maka'ainana hit Kamehameha I over the head with a paddle and broke it. And when the kingdom was established, the first thing that Kamehameha did wisely was to basically say that this person had the right to protect himself against this bullying by those with power. And so therefore the first law of our kingdom is to protect those against who don't have power against those who do, essentially. Unfortunately, the state has very much co-opted that and has changed it. There's actually statutes misconstruing this. Yes, mahalo, Monisha. And so, and it's in the center of the Kanawai Mamalahoi, the law of the splintered paddle is in the center of the HPD badge. So it's, it's very much been taken and used, but not upheld. It's been enshrined is what they call it. But the upholding of that Kanawai, of that essential consensus that we have as a people, that those who don't have power need to be protected from those who do have power, including and especially those with governmental power, is at the core of our very being as a nation. And it is at the core of our work in upholding pono, the balance of things that are right, in the core of our healing, in the core of all that we do. And it is amongst the houseless that, who are those who will not conform to the system, and often are Kanaka who will not conform to that system, along with those who are essentially refugees from other places. We have a lot of refugees from America, and the protection of all of these people is very, very crucial in the restoration of our independence and our identity and our sovereignty. That's about all I can say right now. Mahalo.
Hello, Laulani. That was really necessary for us to start with. And I will now invite Noelani to share.
Mahalo nui. Aloha, I'm Noelani Ahia. I'm really humbled to be here today amongst so many powerhouses in this room. I'm a little bit nervous, so forgive me. My work with the houseless community started recently compared to many of the folks in this room today. And the primary work that I do on Maui is around protection of ancestral burials and iwi kupuna. But I can't help draw the connection between the way that our burials are treated, the way they're literally bulldozed and swept aside, and the way that our Kanaka Maoli people who are tied to this aina for 2,000 years are treated by literally being swept off our land on a regular basis. So I got involved with this potential sweep at Pu'uhonua o Kanaha at Amala Place in Kahului last September. And I was really working to try to, I actually brought the mayor down there because I was trying to humanize folks to the administration. And I had at that time a little bit of a relationship because of the work with the EV. I don't have a relationship with the mayor anymore. Needless to say, he wasn't happy with my work down there. But as Laulani said, we're living in illegally occupied kingdom. And oddly enough, the police started during the kingdom era. And that's something that we have to reconcile with as a people too, because, they like to say that they have to uphold the law, but whose law are they upholding and to whose benefit? And, as Laulani stated as well, the system is entirely set up to privilege those who are resourced and have power and continue to criminalize the most vulnerable. And that's what happened at Kanaha. So, this particular sweep was so heart-wrenching because we were still in the pandemic situation, and the CDC was still recommending that houseless sweeps not take place at all. In fact, most of these folks were actually living at Kanaha Beach Park in a camping ground where they had access to water and they had access to showers and restrooms and basic sanitation. And at the start of the pandemic, the park was closed and all those people were forced to relocate to the road, which became a public nuisance in the eye of the government, the settler state, and our local county government. So basically the county set up the conditions to create this sweep, which they ended up enforcing with law enforcement. And while there were some good cops, because, of course, a lot of them are local and it gets very, very convoluted and conflicted for them too, because they're basically assigned to criminalize their own people, which is a huge trauma on the part of everybody involved. But the way the whole system is set up is to use the law enforcement to bully, to harass, to intimidate. And in fact, I had a conversation with the mayor the day before and I said, please don't bring police. Please don't bring police. It only traumatizes people. People have agreed to leave, but they need to do so in a way that is not harmful. And all of the resources that we were promised would be there were not there. There were so many promises that were unkept by the mayor and by the administration. And there were no mental health workers. There was no trauma-informed care, and law enforcement did what they do. They bullied, they harassed, they threatened to make arrests. They threatened to arrest me as an advocate. They did arrest another advocate who was there as a legal observer on one day and an advocate the next day, and they arrested her. So even for people who are trying to advocate, and we don't have anywhere near the level of trauma that the folks who are houseless have, who have to go through this on a daily basis. So these folks are frequently ticketed because they oftentimes live in their cars, and there is a state law that does not allow for habitation in vehicles. So they get ticketed, they get bench warrants because they can't make their court date. Then they get arrested, then they end up in prison. Now they have a record, and the whole cycle just continues. And it's very, very difficult to get people out of this. In fact, we were working with a family last week, and we were trying to get them housing and working with an agency, and they brought us as advocates, and the agency didn't like having advocates there. And the agency actually called the police on all of us. So law enforcement showed up to intimidate. And this is the cycle that we see over and over again in Hawaii. And with the influx of, just wrapping up, with the influx of foreigners who are moving here and buying up real estate and literally pushing our people out so there's no more space for us, and the police upholding that pattern, we are really, really struggling. And we're really grateful to be here with you all today and build some solidarity. So mahalo nui, aloha.
Mahalo nui, Lani, especially for telling us what's going on in our neighbor island. I will now invite our coalition members to say a little bit about the coalition.
Great, thank you. So this first part, myself and Nina are going to be sharing that. But first of all, thank you all very much, and a big aloha from Skid Row. where we are situated. But before we go into, speaking about the report and some background on the coalition, I think just listening to Noelani, I just wanted to quickly screen share a memo here, which kind of gives us a sense of where we are and where we have been. This is a memo that was released by the Department of Homeland Security back in 2013, where they speak about anti-gentrification activists as anarchist extremists. And this goes into, and this was declassified, and then, we were able to get this. So this goes back at least about 9 years, where they really speak about it in these very interesting terms. And just for a second, if someone can read this, I think that would really help us ground us as well in our conversation. Can someone read that?
I can read it, Hamid.
Sure.
The footnote.
Yes, please, for the purposes of, yeah.
For the purposes of this analysis, DHS understands anarchist extremists' meaning of gentrification to mean the buying and renovation of houses and stores in deteriorated urban neighborhoods by upper or middle income persons, thus improving property values, but often displacing low-income families and small businesses. Anarchist extremists oppose gentrification because they believe it is oppressive and part of a greater class war led by the privileged in society against lower income and working class individuals.
So thank you, Manisha. So that's the landscape that we are working in. That anytime you are engaging in anti-gentrification work, anti-development work, you're immediately considered a threat. Not just to the immediate neighborhood, but you become a national security threat, because obviously, and especially living in LA and obviously in Hawaii as well, issues around land and occupation and then gentrification and development. And this was based upon three just very baseline kind of issues of very low level arson, where there was no, people were not killed or anything. And this was in Vancouver, Canada, Seattle, Washington, and Grand Rapids, Michigan. And then they go on to say that, and they encourage people to, which really kind of reminds me of one of our first campaigns as well around suspicious activity reporting, is then they say that to report suspicious activity, law enforcement officers should follow established agency protocols, order the personnel, blah, 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 and suspicious activity reports will be forwarded to the appropriate fusion center. So first of all, I just want to really appreciate and thank you all for making the time and inviting us, and particularly on this issue, which is not an issue. It is our lives. It is our people's lives. It is our community's health and well-being. So I'm really happy to be here and glad that we are having this conversation. And before we leave, I think our hope is to really build. And these are living conversations. So we don't end here, but we continue building together. And how do we then strategize across this pond? There's always this strategy. It's across that pond where, world destruction is planned between Western Europe and the United States. We're here across this pond. Let's build our power together. So with that, I'm going to go to Matios to see if they were going to, yeah. So that's the beautiful cover. Oops, missed that some. Okay, there we go. That's a beautiful cover. Thank you so much, Nina, for designing that. And these are some of the photos which Nina can talk about too, from the fight around Chavez Ravine and the forced removal of communities, where now we have LA Dodgers Stadium and it's become a recreational park and this, that, and the other. But the fight of the community is still continuing. So that is very much happening. Next slide, please. Well, we can move this one forward. This is just a photo of from when we actually had forced to the Los Angeles Human Relations Commission to hold public hearings on suspicious activity reporting program. Some of our comrades, Joe Thomas, he transitioned, he's not with us. Mimi, he transitioned and not with us either. So, but then rest of the folks, There's Jamie, Pete, Lydia, Kim from YJC, Miguel, Cookie. So there's a whole bunch of folks that have been a part of this, coalition and building this fight for the last 11 years now. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the guiding values that we build our work. But before I go to them, I just really want to quickly emphasize that people have always asked us that why Skid Row, when you're speaking about national security police state, where does Skid Row come in? And I think that's also based upon some of the history that Manisha had shared that I had done and other folks had done as well. Post 9/11, the impact on the South Asian community, being located in Little India and just being on the front line on fighting back with the federal government and local law enforcement agencies, or how racial profiling in the Muslim, South Asian, Middle Eastern, Arab communities were being profiled and impacted. But I think one of the lessons that at least some of us have learned, and I myself I'm an immigrant from Pakistan, living in the United States for the last 40 years or so, have been organizing for about 35 years. And one of the lessons that I've learned over time has been that regardless of who the current faces of state violence, it circles back and brings it back to the criminalization and violence against Black and Indigenous and migrant communities, queer, trans communities, unhoused communities, and poor folks. So everything that was being built under the guise of national security, we knew it was going to come back. So that's where the conversations began. That what place then where race and poverty and suspect bodies are constantly under the microscope, where particularly if you're unhoused, if you're Black, if you're Indigenous, constantly under the microscope, how the tracing and tracking of communities happen and how the communities are being policed. So that's what led us to that ultimately, regardless of what is going on with the national security police state, it's going to circle back and hit the same communities that it always has. But as we were building our fight, we were also debunking a bunch of things as well. And most of the time, surveillance is seen through the lens of invasion of privacy. So we basically challenged that understanding, that we said, no, it's much bigger than that. Because invasion of privacy does a few things. One, it limits the scope of our understanding, it gets individualized. And two, it quite frankly, it's a very privileged space to be kind of just having your privacy invaded when many in the communities the bodies are bare, they're just public. So there is no privacy to begin with. So we kind of broadened the scope and really kind of looking at our fight, because invasion of privacy is also immediately, the fight is in legal responses of filing lawsuits because First Amendment right has been violated or Fourth Amendment right has been violated. But we look at it more as the intent to cause harm, that there's an intentionality, and surveillance and intelligence gathering is always tip of that policing knife, which we as fiercely abolitionists, our goal is really not to build towards reform and kind of making the execution of these programs better, but really to abolish and dismantle these systems. But in order for us to really build that grassroots movement, we had to really ground ourselves both in historic realities and the current trajectory that the police state was on. So the first guiding value is that this is not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. And we will share that a little bit more as we move along. The second one is that there's always the creation of the other. There's always the enemy, the insurgent, the anarchist, the communist, the hordes of migrants. We see that right now of the assault that is going on trans youth all across the country. We're seeing right now that how the assault is going on reproductive rights and reproductive health of femme identified bodies as well. So there's always this creation of other to kind of just get this fear going. And for us, a lot of this work has also been looking at it, that how the face of the savage native was created, how the face of the criminal Black was created, how the face of the illegal Latino was created, how the face of the manipulative Asian was created, how the face of the terrorist Muslim was created, how the face of the deviant trans was created as well. And that's where a lot of these investments and justifications for legislations and structures are built. The third one is to desensationalize the rhetoric of national security, because that was something very important, because it's almost like the terrorists are here, so there's a lot of sensationalism attached to it. But for us, it was really crucial to desensationalize that and bring it to the ground level, bring it down as to where we are rooted, where we are situated. And the last one, not the last one, but another one is that our fight is anchored in human rights, that we don't, and it's not in looking at a very Western sort of a concept of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but just by the virtue of us being human, just by virtue of us claiming our agency and claiming our personhood as well. So those are just some of the things that we have been building on. Next slide, please. So when I was talking about continuation of history, this is where, when we look at these, that we were tracing back, and other scholars have done brilliant work on this too. This lantern laws, we learned through Professor Simone Brown's work, who wrote this book, Dark Matter, about surveillance during the times of slavery. So these are laws that go back 300 years in New York in the early 1700s, where if you were an indigenous or a Black body, enslaved body, you had to walk with a lantern to self-identify yourself as a threat to the system. Of course, the Black Code, especially post-emancipation, that how the Black Codes were created, how slavery continued, and particularly that clause in 13th Amendment for free labor if you were incarcerated, Jim Crow laws. So those are, again, we have to look at the history of surveillance and policing. Next slide, please. So again, that kind of reminds us that where we are today is not just a moment in time, but a continuation of history again, which helps us in understanding our fight as to what was going on and how people have built that fight historically too. Next slide, please. So here I'm going to pass it on to my comrade Nina, and we'll just go from there.
Thanks, Hamid. Hey, y'all. Yeah, so as Hamid was kind of explaining, so something that the coalition really does like grounds itself as well. It's in the saying that it's not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. And I think that that's especially true when you look at like the ways in which reform and different laws as well have been utilized and kind of adapted and continue to target the same communities that they have historically looted, that they've historically targeted. And so when you think of and when we like consider like the lantern laws, current reiterations of it can and does look like stop and frisk, looks like broken windows, like facial recognition, because now not only do you kind of it's expected that if you're going to be moving through the settler colonies, if you're going to be moving through the city or wherever you're at, that's something that you have to pay with, as far as like being surveilled, going through facial recognitions and the different technologies that they are able to deploy and utilize to continue to collect all this data on our communities. And so we also think about like Black codes and how like now the reiterations that we're seeing, and specifically in LA or so-called LA, because even that it's also grounding the fact that we're on stolen Tongva territory. And so one current kind of legislation as well is a reformed 4118, which used to be 4118D, and of course, after the court systems found it or had some challenges to it, how the city is able to adapt that and how like they're able to change up that language to not provide the support that our communities need, but to provide the best legal support to continue doing the harm and the intent to cause harm, which is what they are intended to do. And that's the root of what the cause and the harm that they cause in our communities, as well with the Jim Crow laws. And we'll go into more about hotspots, but hotspots is also another form, and we noticed it in LAPD and how they're utilizing specific areas where they call hotspots, which are just areas where they're designating as areas that will have a lot of crime, and so areas that they designate more resources to surveil, to stop the folks in the community in those areas. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So this slide, it talks about like the history of policing. So how everything, right, from red squads, the war on drugs, war on crimes, it's not just something that happens in isolation, but how the intersections of technology, policing, and surveillance, and looking at the larger context of the history of policing and how technology is used to enhance and solidify power and policing in new ways, but it's also rooted in the longer history of what policing is meant to do. And so that's something that the coalition is really grounded in both in knowing our fight and being able to specify how past programs and how current reiterations are all tied to one another. And Matthews, if we can go to the next slide. And so this is the architecture surveillance. This is one of the pop ed tools that the coalition has been working on. This is as well, it helps map out through our own research as well, through public records, through news articles. We were able to kind of piece together more and more about the ways in which the surveillance is mapped, and how the information sharing network and how that kind of plays. And so in this document for the architecture surveillance, you'll see SAR, which is the suspicious activity reporting, and how like that was one of the first fights that we launched. And so that's one of the ways in which kind of the network in which they continue to surveil our communities. And then we also see in one of these, the fusion centers, which is there are over 80 fusion centers across the country, one of the largest being in LA County, and that covers several different communities and counties within so-called LA, including Riverside, Orange County, and San Bernardino. And it's where data collection happens and where data is stored, and where they are able to share that not only with LAPD, but with other agencies as well, including ICE, including the Department of Homeland Security. And so the ways in which it's not only an incident, or it's not only one agency that's gathering this information, but the larger ways in which it's also tied and how that information is also shared. And if we can go to the next slide, we're going to watch a short clip real quick, and it's from the Stalker State, but we'll go more into it once we look at this short little video. Perfect. Yes, and that's also thank you so much for Sum and for like the community as well that comes together to put together the visuals and incorporate storytelling and the ways in which we are reclaiming our narratives by being able to tell that. And so the different ways in which the stalker state kind of works through. And so right here you see the stalker state, which has a map out about like the different ways in which policing takes place, and also honoring it in like when we talk about abolition and when we talk about a world without policing, it's also really important to look at the larger web where it happens, because it's also the ways in which the Department of Family Services as well, how that plays a huge role when you're going through the metro station and that data is analyzed, the surveillance cameras as well, and the different networks and systems and institutions, both private and public, that continue to work with one another to continue to not care for our communities, but to provide that data and to continue to banish and to isolate a lot of our community members. And so when we do talk about abolition, I think it's also important to honor and to name that, and to name the different ways in which it shows up, whether it's through different agencies, whether it's through the policing that we do on our communities as well, whether it's through gender, whether it's through sexuality, the different ways in which we are also the larger community policing aspects of that as well. And I'm going to pass it over to Monisha to cue or to kind of go back into the how policing and how criminalization happens, and specifically with housing as well.
Thank you so much, Hamid and Ni. I thought we were going to weave in the voices of folks who are working in the community here, and I wanted to introduce to you Kalani Young, Tina Grandinetti, and Richard Rath to talk a little bit about their work. I'm going to, I'm very honored to have them here, and I'll do an introduction for them. Tatiana Kalaniopua Young is Kanaka Maoli Mahu Plus healer, community organizer, and scholar activist who has been involved with Pu'uhonua at Waianae, a 10-city village on Oahu. She writes about this community in her dissertation. Tina Grandinetti, born and raised in Hawaii, is a scholar activist who is involved in addressing housing insecurity in the face of urban renewal on Oahu. Today, she'll be speaking on the experiences in Kaka'ako, which is now a luxury redevelopment district. And then we'll have Richard Rath, who is Associate Professor in Ethnic Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Currently, he's researching the intersections of artificial intelligence, art, and surveillance, as well as the politics and economics of Hawaii's hotel industry workers during the pandemic from the perspective of workers. As someone who has experienced being unhoused for a few years long ago, Rich has an abiding interest in addressing the sources rather than the symptoms of the problem. So with that, I will ask Kalani to start us off with some.
Yeah, mahalo. This has been so rich and so wonderful to hear all of these different knowledges and all of the experiences coming from, from the community. So for me, I initially was interested in Pu'uhonua and sort of the reclamation of our places of refuge in a sea of real estate capitalism and the devastation it has brought to our communities, and especially within the context of colonization and occupation. So for me, growing up in Hawaii as a Kanaka, as, a trans woman, as a mahu, like first, growing up, you have relatives that, are displaced and oftentimes forced to live on the streets or live on the beach. And so, initially my interest in the subject came from my upbringing and living with relatives on the beach, both for recreation and also family members forced to live there, like my Auntie Bama, who I've talked extensively about, my mom's sister, who refused to, in many different ways, as Laulani has talked about, has refused to acknowledge the state of Hawaii as a legitimate government here. So, for me, I'm really interested in Pu'uhonua places and people of refuge as a way of organizing abandonment in the shadows of a settler state. And so for me, going to Pu'uhonua, Waianae, and also having the experiences of being unsheltered myself, both by force, but also by choice at different times in my life, I think provides sort of my interest in supporting the reclamation of our bodies and our places as sacred. So what I mean by that sacredness is as Laulani talked about in the Kanawai Mamalahoi, for me, as the first law of the Kingdom of Hawaii, was really a law against the abuse of power of the state. And for me, capitalism and the state go hand in hand. So obviously the reclamation of Pu'uhonua is a reclamation of our aina, is a reclamation of our bodies and our people as important, as valuable. Our stories, our bodies, our mana, our power is really important to reclaim. And one of the, I guess, in writing that piece, Home is What We Make It, I was thinking about, Auntie Twinkle, and who's a queer Kanaka, who's the leader of Pu'uhonua Waianae, and the different ways that she has organized both institutionally situated people and unsheltered community through aloha, through love, which is ultimately our greatest intelligence. And I think that, you know, it sounds, what do you call it? Like, I don't want to get lovey-dovey, but I think love is really important here. Loving one another, taking care of one another, and creating spaces where we can express that love by protecting one another. And I think that, you know, we're all human at the end of the day. Yeah. So, you know, I, as an abolitionist and as an anarchist, I often feel like this, you know, for reasons laid out before me. I feel it's really important to see one another as human beings, whether we wear a badge or we live outside or inside, you know, to come to each other with aloha, I think is really, really critical. And I try to focus on that as a power. So, mahalo.
Mahalo, Kalani. That was so beautiful. I'll call Tina to the floor.
Aloha, thank you so much for having me. I've been waiting for a conversation like this to happen since 2019. I'm kind of gonna piggyback off of Kalani's work in Pu'uhonua, Hawai'i. I also spent some like part of my field work for my dissertation there. But today I'm talking about Kaka'ako, and those are two like really parallel stories at Pu'uhonua, Hawai'i, which kind of is on the like urban periphery of Honolulu. A houseless community was able to like form sanctuary through Aloha. And then in Kaka'ako, which is a urban renewal district that is like completely dominated by luxury development, we saw a really different story. So Kaka'ako is made up of the ili of Ka'akaukukui and Kukulu'aeo. And it's been marked as a development district since the 70s. And it was actually, initiated the creation of the Hawaii Community Development Authority, which is agency tasked with creating public-private partnerships to facilitate rapid development. And its original mandate was to create workforce housing for Honolulu, but we've seen that go a completely different way. 3 landlords dominate the area. There's Howard Hughes, which is a publicly traded real estate development company. They've done the Seaport District in New York City and developments in Houston. But then there's also 2 indigenous serving institutions that are landlords. There's Kamehameha Schools, which is a private charitable educational trust endowed by Princess Bernice Pauahi Bishop. And then there's the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, which is a semi-autonomous state agency, which was created to administer monies from former ceded, actually unceded lands now held in trust for Native Hawaiians by the state of Hawaii. So we can talk like a lot about how OHA received land in Kaka'ako as a settlement for unceded land revenue claims. But for now, the 2 urban renewal projects that are really shaping the landscape are Howard Hughes Ward Village and Kamehameha Schools are Kaka'ako. And so during the first round of these 2 redevelopment projects, we saw a houseless encampment grow to about 500 people. And that was related also to sit-lie bans in Waikiki, which is our like tourism strip. And so a lot of the people I talked to from the HCDA, as well as planners and volunteers and people who experienced houselessness, would say that the Honolulu police would actually encourage people to move to Kaka'ako, where they could so like people in Waikiki who are being swept, they would tell them like go to Kaka'ako, and they would be relatively undisturbed there, because there's this jurisdictional gray space where like some of the parks are owned by the HCDA, but they don't have enforcement capabilities of their own. So people were funneled there, and like Noelani said, the state really created the conditions that it then used to justify the sweep of nearly 500 people. This community was made up about like 2/3 were of Native Hawaiian or Polynesian descent. Roughly the other third were reported through surveys to be compacted free association migrants from Micronesia, and roughly 40% were families. And there was an effort to form community and to create community guidelines, but because of the intense police sweeps, that all of those efforts kept getting disrupted. So whereas in Waianae, where the harbor master originally gave Auntie Twinkle 90 days to organize her community, in Kaka'ako, where there's luxury like high rises, like rising above you, that community didn't have the same option. And that, you know, makes us ask, like, where does settler capitalism allow pu'uhonua to exist, and where does it have to eliminate it for its own survival? Because in Kaka'ako, there was such a huge expectation of profit and of like settler claims, and that always demands the removal of indigenous people and turning them into the other or the unwanted or the dirty or the criminal. So after the first huge sweep in 2015, Mayor Kurt Caldwell actually formally honored the Department of Facility Maintenance, Stored Property, and Sidewalk Nuisance Enforcement crew, and the HPD District 1 Community Policing team for cleaning up the remains of that encampment. And he told the press it was really pilau kind of work. They had to deal with syringes, hundreds of them were lying around, dangerous health hazards, and yet they stepped up. They had to grab things where there could be ukus, lice, other things, centipedes, scorpions. So he uses this word pilau, which is like rotten or putrid, in like a formal honoring of the community police for sweeping the remains of a community. And then after that sweep, the HCDA started paying a private company called Block by Block over $300,000 a year to enforce park closure times. And the people who remained, I'm wrapping up soon. They dwindled down to about 30 to 50 people who were constantly called like hardcore homeless. And I think, and then the ultimate response was for the HCDA to transfer the parks to the city and county of Honolulu, so there could be easier coordination for enforcement by HPD. And I think that the thing I want to leave us with is that question of where are pu'uhonua allowed to exist, and then also, you know, this whole time, and Lindsay has all of this lived experience and expertise. A group called Kapo'eo Kaka'ako, made up of people that the media would call hardcore houseless or homeless. They were organizing the same ways that pu'uhonua o Waianae were, and their efforts weren't met with the same kind of praise. And I feel like that shows that we need to move away from these moral tests for houseless folks to prove that they deserve stability or safety or just the right to exist in public space. And we need to like really come at this from the perspective of abolition, that nobody who has been abandoned or banished by the state from housing and from community deserves to then be policed for that kind of dispossession. Thank you.
Mahalo, Tina. That was very powerful. And I'm going to hand it over to Rich to wrap us up, and then we'll go to the coalition, back to the coalition.
Thank you, Monisha, and thank you for everyone who shared. I just, I relate to so many things here as someone, a thriving neurodivergent person who has experienced houselessness and police violence, and I like to look at the causes of being unhoused rather than, you know, the effects of it, which are the people who are taking the brunt of the abuse, which is the houseless themselves. So I want to stay really focused. I have a task here. I read, not thoroughly, but as well as I could quickly, I read Automating Banishment a week or two ago, and I found out about these things that I didn't know about, business improvement districts, and found out we have a special one in Hawaii, in Waikiki, the Hawaii Special Business Improvement District. I'm going to share screen really quickly and just give you a very brief tour of a group of people that you have probably seen if you've been in Waikiki, the Aloha Ambassadors. The Aloha Ambassadors, which I always thought were like volunteers who had time on their hands or something, are actually rent-a-cops. They're security workers for Block by Block, which Tina mentioned is busy in Kaka'ako too. In Waikiki, they're paid another $1 million a year as of 2014, probably more by now, to basically deter. So they give you one face if you're a tourist and another face if you're someone who they consider needing deterrence. This Maria, this does involve the sit-lie ban. They come and try to roust people gently. They call this outreach to street people and say they have trained ambassadors doing the outreach. The trained ambassadors are paid about $8 an hour less and get no guidance. They're supposed to set up pipelines to get people out of Waikiki and into services. So what they do is get people out of Waikiki. They're not so good at the services part. They are part of Block by Block. Block by Block is an offshoot from Brantley Security, a private security firm. They're strongly anti-union, and they actually hire people, sort of like using Buffalo Soldiers. They hire formerly houseless people as the security people, give them less, low wage jobs, and they are in charge of not just cleaning and landscaping, but also safety and security. They report any suspicious activities in need of deterrence to a manager who has a direct line to the local police station in Waikiki. And they also have access to all the closed circuit televisions, not closed circuit televisions, closed circuit cameras in Waikiki, which are, they're every other light post practically. So this is a surveillance strategy. It's very active in Waikiki. It's low-wage job that divides people by serving as a pipeline. Some people come in from houselessness. Other people, when I looked at the glass door, glass ceiling site, other people, I'll wrap up now. Other people have left Block by Block under duress, under racist conditions and other problems, and ended up being unhoused again. So it's a bi-directional pipeline in some respects. And the history of it fits right in with the stuff that Hamid was talking about with surveillance. So basically, next time you visit Waikiki and see a smiling or frowning Aloha ambassador, that's a little bit of their story. So thank you, everybody. I will remember to stop sharing and turn it back over.
Thank you so much. Over to our coalition comrades. They want to say a little bit about the report. We are running a little bit late, which we anticipated, but we will have the breakout rooms. And coalition members, if you want to respond to anything in the chat, please do.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. And Mattis, I think we can see your desktop, but we're not seeing the the slides. But yeah, so I think what we want to turn to before the breakout groups is kind of talking about what is the role of data in all of this, and kind of how data and these surveillance technologies are really how police and the state are coordinating all this displacement. That is, we're talking about these sit-lie bans. That's in Los Angeles. That's what Nina was talking about, the 4118. That's our equivalent. How the revamped version of that, the reformed version of that, is basically a sort of zone by zone strategy where police are first using kind of surveillance and community policing strategies to monitor encampments, to even under the guise of outreach and kind of contact and services and the kinds of things we've been talking about, using that to identify and map out who's in, where encampments are, who's in them, who's the leaders, those kinds of things. And then using that as part of the strategy of then banning encampments and sweeping them. But often when we talk about data, it's and data-driven policing and police technology, there's a real sort of sensationalist kind of focus on digital technologies, on kind of algorithmic and AI technologies, which are definitely things that, for example, LAPD is using. But we try to make sure that we're like we've been talking about, kind of grounding it in the longer history of where these, what are the ideologies, practices, histories that today's data-driven policing practices build on. And so this slide kind of lists that all out. And the goal here, when we talk about policing originating in colonization and policing originating in the defense of occupied land and stolen land, that's partly that's we're talking about an ideological lineage, a historical lineage, but also that's kind of the logic of policing that really even helps explain and understand what police are doing today. So in Los Angeles today, we're kind of within a regime that is spending, and the sit-lie ban is very much a part of, is directly central to this, that's spending millions and millions of dollars on enforcement of laws against encampments, basically building up in shelter capacity, building up temporary housing capacity, investing millions in that to temporarily remove people from the streets, put them through these kind of carceral housing programs that they then get dumped out of again to homelessness and encampments, when really, that's just that's because cycling people in and out. And that, that solution is costing the city far more than it would cost to just build housing for people. And that people sort of ask, why is it that's sort of illogical? Why is the city spending so much money on that? Violent sort of criminalization of unhoused people rather than just housing them. And again, that's where the legislative sort of police use policing, prisons, criminalization to enforce property, to enforce and to enforce the ownership of stolen land. So that in that lineage we see that's the roots of colonization, as well as these different programs over time, including, for example, broken windows policing, which is basically the mechanism of how unhoused people are targeted. It looks like my connection is poor, but yeah, hopefully it's clear now. But these programs that basically are kind of draconian enforcement of minor laws against unhoused people. Those are the kind of those are sort of the building blocks of how police have collected data on our communities and now use that data to select targets, to target encampments, and to kind of today's data-driven policing programs. So let's go to the next slide. And so that data that now defines kind of police enforcement priorities, the places they're going to target, and how policing priorities are kind of defined. That a lot of that is just what is referred to as kind of crime data, as data on where crimes have occurred, who's doing them, and we've kind of in the coalition come to recognize and we organize against the fact that these are just often they're just reflective of the choices that police are making. In the same way that kind of Nalani and Tina were talking about the state creating the conditions for these sweeps, and laying the groundwork for it through one, like, denial and deprivation of resources, but also just constant kind of enforcement, surveillance, targeting, and ticketing. That likewise is that's also how this kind of crime data is constructed in order to target people, to take them off the streets and criminalize them or place them in really carceral housing. Let's go to the next slide. Oh yeah, so this is a video, and Matios after me is going to talk a little bit about one of LAPD's predictive policing programs that kind of weaponize all of that data to select individuals and places to target. So, that use of data when the program first launched was kind of celebrated as a way of making policing more efficient and accountable and fair, bias-free because of the use of data. We will talk more about the actual toll of the programs and what actually played out in that use of data. But this is a clip from a conversation we had with the grandmother of a person who was killed in one of these zones that were targeted under the LAPD program that was sort of a data-driven kind of hotspot for crime that police were targeting for extreme surveillance and enforcement. So we had a conversation with Mary Williams, that's the grandmother of Keith Bursey, who was one of the people killed, and asked her, what do you think of this notion that data makes policing kind of more fair or more efficient?
But they put the data in the computer. And the computer just don't go out and pick up data and put it in. It's them that puts the data in the computer. So the races and the injustice comes from the person. A human have to work the computer.
Yeah, so the point there is I think it's pretty common sense, and it's clear to most of us, but this kind of notion that data is going to help make policing more efficient or fair or eliminate its biases, eliminate its kind of oppression, is an ideology that's really common. And so I think one aspect of it, the one that Ms. Williams was talking about, of how data reflects the racial biases of past policing, that's kind of a crucial part of the story, and that's a big part of how these predictive and data-driven policing programs are running. But I think what we've also been uncovering, and this is what our automating banishment report that we're talking about today really gets into, is also how the logic of real estate development, the logic of land theft, of colonization, of colonialism show up in policing. And so this map is kind of part of what was the inspiration for a lot of that study. And so this map is basically, so these orange and red dots here are different hotspots under a predictive policing program that was called PredPol, stands for predictive policing. It's a kind of private company that LAPD actually was one of the first people to test this program. It was developed by UCLA academics and is now sold to police departments across the country. So these hotspots are basically where police are targeting for increased enforcement based on past policing practices. So saying this is where crimes are happening before, so this is where we're going to put the most police to target them. So for people who aren't familiar with Los Angeles, so this is basically downtown Los Angeles, and that green box there, the green whatever that shape, the rectangle thing, trapezoid, is Skid Row. That's where we're based. And Skid Row, for people who know about the kind of enforcement about policing in Los Angeles, is the most policed part of the city. It's where there's the heaviest concentration of ticketing, of patrols, of LAPD activity in general. So under this kind of notion of a kind of clean, sort of, one way people think about how these algorithms are harmful is just this idea of like a feedback loop, kind of that because there's racist data going in, there's going to be racist data coming out. So you would expect under that feedback loop for the place that has the most heavy concentration of policing, Skid Row, to also have the heaviest concentration of these hotspots. That's what that data, racist data in, racist data out idea sort of implies. But if you look at the lines of Skid Row there, instead what we see is that this policing is concentrated, or these hotspots are concentrated around the edges of Skid Row, serving as a sort of containment or buffer, like almost like a digital wall around Skid Row, the purpose of which is to maintain the kind of lines of segregation and gentrification on the other side of so that's Main Street is the one to the left there. On the other side of that are the kind of penthouses and gentrifying lofts and stuff of high rises of downtown now. So what this kind of showed us is that we need to look beyond just this kind of notion of that policing, that data-driven policing is just automating the logic of just automating kind of racist practices, but rather that it reflects in a more deep way whatever the logic of real estate development and containment and targeting of communities is. Because what we're also seeing now is this is how Skid Row is being policed as kind of a containment strategy of containing the city's poorest and most resource deprived neighbors into one part of the city, and then kind of creating this buffer of keeping them in and not concentrating sort of stress policing in that one area. So that is what kind of led us to start examining. So what are this is what we understand about Skid Row, because we have a real understanding of the history of how containment and how containment is operated in Skid Row. But we also then wanted to look at kind of how the logics of real estate development and displacement across the city are also defining how data-driven policing is operating in those places. So let's go to the next slide. Oh yeah, real quick. So this is just something that I encourage folks to look up. It's kind of a tool that we created basically for sort of mapping our fights against different programs and different algorithms or technologies. And the goal is to decenter here. PredPol is in the middle there, but it's to decenter the role of just PredPol alone and to look at all of the kind of operational, ideological, institutional, nonprofit, academic institutions that form an ecosystem around that, and that then are in that same, help explain why it is that the policing priorities reflect the kind of containment strategy like we were talking about in the last map. And so this is a tool that's available online. I encourage you to use it to kind of map your own campaigns and fights. Matheus, I think you're next.
Yeah, hey folks, my name is Matheus. I use he, him pronouns. So earlier Shakir had talked about PredPol, data-driven policing program that the LAPD had. I'm going to talk about another one called Operation Laser. Operation Laser was rolled out by the LAPD in 2011. It started in 77th Division, which is based in South LA, a predominantly Black and brown neighborhood. And Laser was a location-based and person-based data-driven policing program. And we have here an image produced by 77th Station where they kind of spell out Laser, and it stands for Los Angeles Strategic Extraction. And it actually stands for restoration. They messed up their own acronym in this image. But what we see here is a graphic of a laser actually shooting right into South LA, just to kind of give you the vibe of what they were going for with this program. And here we have a quote from Craig Uchida, who, along with his company JSS, created Laser. He says, the program is analogous to laser surgery, where a trained medical doctor uses modern technology to remove tumors. The tumors they're referencing over here are Black and brown communities. And this is dehumanizing language we see everywhere, similar to what Tina had brought up earlier regarding communities that were pushed out there. And so, yeah, Laser was location-based and person-based. And the location component looked like these laser kill zones, which are what we see over here, these big squares. And so these zones, along with these dots called anchor points, were just heavily flooded with police. And the presence of police inevitably led to stops, right? So, the heaviest volume of these stops were in South Central and in downtown LA. And so these maps right here, this is the Crenshaw corridor, South LA, and this is the Slauson area. We have a picture of, I know it's kind of hard to see, Nipsey Hussle here and his Marathon store. And Nipsey's store was located in an opportunity zone. And these opportunity zones were areas that were deemed kind of neglected. And so, they were incentivized for people to invest in. But what we saw is Nipsey invested in his own neighborhood, designated an opportunity zone, promoting Black autonomy. And this just didn't vibe well with local policing. And so it was designated a laser zone. His store was actually designated an anchor point. And so just as every other area in Laser is inundated by police and flooded with stops, that was the case for Nipsey's store as well. We include in the report that from the mission sheets, we found that less than 2 weeks after the opening of the Marathon store, a single patrol car, one car, made 103 stops and 3 arrests in a 7-day span. So just constantly flooded by police, leading to these police interactions. And we see in this map over here with the Crenshaw corridor, we've got names here, and these are the names of individuals killed by LAPD within these laser kill zones. We have Riddell Jones, Grishario Mack, who's killed inside the Crenshaw Mall, Keith Bursey, whose grandmother, Mary Williams, we heard speak earlier, who had an interaction just a couple months prior with the officer that would end up killing him. And so, yeah, and these stops aren't a coincidence. They're actually by design. We included a quote by Craig Uchida in the prior slide. He talks about the notion of these stops and like how frequently these stops happen. And what he says about these stops is most of the time it didn't lead to anything. He explained about the stops and the production of field interview cards, but it was data that went into the system, and that's what I wanted. So again, just this constant harassment, which has always been a reality for Black Angelenos, but we kind of see operationalized here. So again, Laser was location-based in the formation of those kill zones, but it was also person-based through the pursuit of these quote-unquote chronic offenders, which were people targeted within communities and designated points for any number of reasons. Here we have, like, if a field interview card was made about you, or if you were stopped by police and information was taken down, you were designated a point. And so these people would be designated points and just pursued and harassed within neighborhoods. And so the coalition actually, through a lawsuit, was able to get a list of the individuals involved in these chronic, or who were listed and targeted in these chronic offender bulletins. And there were people with points, there were people with no points that were just arbitrarily being targeted. And we found that almost half of them were Black, and a fifth had 0 points. So just arbitrarily chosen for being in a community. And again, these were people that were constantly harassed, which inevitably led to their incarceration, worse, violence, right? So this is just, again, another tactic in the pursuit of banishment of community members within the Laser program, and extracting this community, what they've deemed a tumor. And so, yeah, I'm going to pass it back to you real quick, Shakir.
Well, I think so. Yeah, there's a couple more programs we're going to talk about, but I know we want to go to the breakout groups. And so I know we're dividing that into one to talk about the kind of collective research and collective study that produced this report. And so I think that's a good place to talk about the programs. Then another one I think is going to be talking about sort of our organizing around with using art and creative expression. And so that'll also be talking about how we expose a lot of these programs.
Thank you, Coalition. Comrades, we will now open up 2 breakout rooms, and you can choose to go to whichever breakout room you want to. I see that there's a very rich conversation going on in chat, as well as the Padlet, so bring those to the rooms. The Coalition really wants to hear from you and build power with you. So Sky, you will create the rooms.